Good day traders, welcome to a new week and another RMD technical market overview. Markets continue to show extreme volatility and it's now more important than ever to approach trading with a proper game plan, especially if you consider what happened with gold last week. So let's get started. I'm going to let the disclaimer roll and we'll see you back in the charts. We start this week by looking at the US dollar to South African rand. Last week did not see a retest of the weekly pivot as we might have expected, but we did see a retest of support and another leg down towards this area of 1521, and that is also the area of support for this week. It's the weekly S1 and also the monthly S3 pivot. Currently price is contending with the weekly pivot at 1547. This is the new weekly pivot for this week. And of course, should price break below that, that is when we will perhaps see this area of support being tested. However, should price manage to break back above the weekly pivot or just hold above the weekly pivot, the areas of resistance would be this monthly ST pivot at 1566 and also the area just above that at the weekly R1 pivot at 1573. So that would be the area over here. Should price manage to break above that, that means it would be breaking above the highs from last week, and that would then target this area between the monthly S1 pivot at 1594 and the weekly R2 pivot at 16, where it will also meet up with this 4-hour 100 SMA. Moving on now to the Euro USD. Last week saw price briefly tag the first long target, and that was the area at 1.191, where we also have our yearly R2 pivot. After that, price then pulled back and consolidated mostly around this 4-hour 200 SMA. We can see that that's the red line up there. So that we found some support, and currently price is right on our new weekly pivot at 1.183. The trend is still bullish. As we can see, we have these lower and upper diagonals both pointing upwards, meaning that should price manage to break back above the weekly pivot and hold above the weekly pivot, that could potentially target areas of the yearly R2 pivot again, and perhaps the area just above that or at the weekly R1 pivot at 1.192. That does create what seems to be a rising wedge, meaning that there is the possibility that it could break down. And should that happen, and should price break below the weekly pivot, we have this area of potential consolidation. There's also the chance that price might not break above the weekly pivot soon in this week, but perhaps rather just consolidate in this area between the weekly pivot at 1.13 and the weekly S1 pivot at 1.174, meaning this would then be this consolidation zone. Also, if price were to break below this and below this area, the area of support would be at our weekly S2 pivot at 1.165, and that would also be a potential target should this wedge start breaking down somewhere in the week. Just having a brief look at the economic calendar for the week, we can see that later today, or like this morning, we have the Bank of Australia governor speaking at 10:40. Then just looking at some other high impact events. Tomorrow, Tuesday, we have OPEC meetings, core retail sales. There's also the Bank of England governor speaking at 4. Wednesday, again, some events from Australia. The Bank of England governor speaking again. On Thursday, there's unemployment rates and unemployment changes throughout the evening or the afternoon rather. And then on Friday, rather muted, some retail sales. And then on Saturday, there's going to be some G20 meetings, and that would perhaps carry into the next week. We are now continuing on to the GBPUSD. Price is still slowly continuing to trend upwards, with the high of last week just above the first bullish target that we set at 1.326. That was last week's weekly R1 pivot. After that, we saw price pulling back to this monthly R1 pivot at 1.314, and that area has so far held up well. We can also see we have some additional support from the 4-hour 50 SMA. So for this week, the important thing would be to get back above the weekly pivot at 1.320. That will perhaps allow another leg up in this, let's call it this ascending triangle. That could give us a target in between 1.330 and 1.333. That is the weekly R1 pivot and monthly R2 pivot. And from there, we could perhaps see another retest of the lower diagonal. If at any stage price breaks below this lower diagonal, and especially the weekly pivot, the targets would include, that would be the bearish targets, would include this area of about 1.294, which is the weekly S1 pivot, and also possibly where we would meet up with the 4-hour 100 SMA. And of course, should price break below that, the next area of support, and which is a stronger area of support, would be this area where price would meet up with the projected daily 100 SMA and also the monthly pivot at 1.3, and the projected daily 100 SMA is the one we have here in blue. So you can see that is where it will then perhaps meet up with the monthly pivot, and that would act as a strong area of support. Looking now at the Australian dollar to USD. Last week saw price briefly tagging our bullish target at 0.733. That is the monthly R2 pivot, after which it mostly just continued to consolidate on top of this major diagonal support in this case. From there, we can see that price then closed right below what is our new weekly pivot at 0.727. And it would seem there could be some room for a deeper pullback towards this 4-hour 100 SMA, where it could meet up with the monthly R1 pivot at 0.717. We can also see that we have our 4-hour 200 SMA just below that, and that means this area right between the weekly S2 pivot and monthly R2 pivot would be an area of support should price move into this area. However, should price actually manage to drive price back above the weekly pivot, new bullish targets could include firstly this area of 0.733. That is where our monthly R2 and weekly R1 pivot meets. And then, of course, we also have that second possible target around 0.739, and that is also very near to the top of this overhead diagonal. Just considering a deeper sell-off where price breaks below this area of support at 0.75 and below our 4-hour 200 SMA, that could potentially cause a sell-off to this area of the monthly pivot at 0.709. Looking now at the Nasdaq 100 or US 100, last week saw price mostly contending with the monthly R1 pivot level at 11,923. We can see that it initially used to be support, and then after it broke through that, then became resistance. This week we start the week with the price right below our weekly pivot, which is also at the monthly R1 pivot at 11,924. We also have our 4-hour 50 SMA acting as some support, so keep an eye on that for some price action. The idea would be that should price manage to get back above the monthly R1 pivot and break through this level, that would mean this level then once again becomes support, and that could open up targets of last week's high at the weekly R1 at 12414, that's 12,413, and perhaps even higher towards the monthly R2 pivot at 12,742 to the weekly R2 pivot at 12,867. So that could be the potential areas of resistance should price manage to break higher. However, there's also the chance that we just see more consolidation, and should that happen, the area between the 4-hour 100 and 200 SMAs, that is about 11,642, and this monthly pivot would be, monthly R1 pivot would be the area to consider for consolidation. Break below, that could trigger a break towards initial support at 11,450. That's the monthly pivot, and perhaps even as low as the weekly S2 pivot at 11,061. Moving on now to Brent crude oil. Last week saw price finally confidently break through this 4-hour 100 SMA. That was then followed by resistance, which was at 42, and soon after that hit our target that we had set at 43. It even made a slightly higher target at around 45.30. After that, we saw a pullback towards this area where we have our new weekly pivot at 42.50, and it also closed precariously close to this lower diagonal and the strong bullish channel that has been creating in the process. This could potentially trigger a bear flag, meaning that should price perhaps break below this weekly pivot, we also have some additional support at 42.06, but should price break below that, that could see a sell-off towards support in between maybe the monthly pivot at 39.34 and this weekly S1 pivot at 39.69. However, should price action manage to stay above the weekly pivot and move back into this bullish channel, targets could include the weekly R1 pivot at 45.50 and perhaps even this monthly R2 pivot at 46.23. There's also some more scope. As you can see, we have this overhead diagonal, and meaning a larger push higher could see price reach the weekly R2 pivot at 48.28. We are now looking at gold. On last week, Monday, just shortly after tagging the monthly R2 pivot, we saw a very aggressive sell-off. It's one of the largest, most aggressive sell-offs that I've personally seen in quite a while, and I'm sure this caught a lot of traders off guard, and especially those who don't use a fixed stop loss. And I believe this is actually a very good scenario to prove the point of using a stop loss, because we never know when something like this might happen in the future. Gold has since seen a slight recovery and let me just quickly draw the Fibonacci levels. So just drawing the Fibonacci levels from the high to the low of that sell-off, we can see that gold has seen a slight recovery towards this 38.2 Fibonacci level, and that is also where it's finding some resistance now from the 4-hour 100 and 200 SMAs. This is also the area where we have our new weekly pivot at 1,902. In this recovery process, we have also now have this lower diagonal support line, and if price could get back above this resistance at 1,902, that could perhaps see a stronger recovery towards the 61.8 Fibonacci level, which also coincides with the monthly R1 pivot at 1,920. If at any stage price were to break below this, let's call it diagonal support, that could see another test of this area of maybe 1,847, and that is where our monthly S1 pivot meets up with this larger diagonal support. There's also the chance, of course, that price manages to make up for this sell-off from last week and recover the ground lost, and that could see price then move back towards this area in between 1,952 and 1,963, which is the area between the weekly R1 pivot and also the monthly R2 pivot. We are finally concluding this week's technical market overview by looking at Bitcoin. We are on a daily time frame, and last week did not disappoint with our price target at the monthly R2 pivot at the 16,500 being reached to the T. You can see that is exactly where the high was made. Support for this week can be found at the junction where the lower diagonal support and the monthly R1 pivot meets at 15,143. The weekly pivot is just above that at 15,820, and a bullish price action from this level could see another go at this area of resistance now at 16,500. And if price can break through that, the new targets could include 17,500. That is the weekly R2 pivot. And perhaps if price can get above that, I'll have to zoom out slightly. We can see we have another bullish target way up there at 18,685, and that is the yearly R2 pivot. Just considering the event of a bearish break below 15,143, that could see a retest of this yearly R1 pivot at 13,000. However, there is some additional areas of support in between. As you can see, there's also some support at around 14,100, being the weekly S2 pivot. I hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you did, please give us a thumbs up, and also don't forget to subscribe. Also, please consider signing up on our website www.rmdtrader.com, as we are now also offering our clients access to a selection of ETFs, that is exchange traded funds, on top of our already comprehensive product offering. Until next time, this is John Jacobs for RMD Trader. Trade smart and trade successful.